Halloween, Chapter 13. On a dark cul-de-sac called Porter Lane, three figures dressed in dark clothes stealthily approached a large stone house. A big picture window commanding a sweeping lawn revealed a family watching television. A father and mother, a young girl, a baby boy, and an older woman, presumably the grandmother. The three dark shapes blended with the shadows like jaguars stalking their prey. On a signal from the one in the center, the other two fanned out, approaching the target window from the flanks while the leader bellied toward the middle. Now the three crouched directly underneath the window, and the leader indicated it was time. They donned their fright mask and rose up as one with their soap bars. "Yar!" they roared, slamming their open palms on the window, while scrawling with the soap bars with their free hands. The children went shrieking out of the den. The older woman put her hand to her heart and screamed silently. The mother gazed stupidly, while the father, who was the only one to grasp what was really happening, stared in a combination of anger and amusement. He had probably done the same thing whenever he was a kid. Howling with laughter, Keith, Richie, and Lonnie fled into the night, cutting across the frozen bed of the stream on the Samuels' property and slowing to a panting walk on Willow Circle. "Did you see the look on the old lady's face?" Keith said. "Yeah, I just hope she didn't have a heart attack," said Lonnie. "Now what?" Richie asked. "The Myers house, right?" said Lonnie. "Right. Look at Richie," Keith said to Lonnie. "He looks like we just asked him to drop his pants in Taft Square." "Bullshit," the smallest of the three said. "Then let's go, and you'll go in first." "Fine," Richie said, biting his lip. They cut across the Henderson backyard and found themselves on the sidewalk 2 houses down from the Myers house. It stood, squat and dark and malevolent, among its neighbors like some deformed creature. The gusty wind beat the branches of a huge untrimmed tree against the upper story. "Okay, wise ass, lead the way," said Lonnie. Richie stuck his chin out. "Sure, watch." He strode arrogantly up to the front door, then faltered. He turned to his friends and gestured for them to follow. Lonnie and Keith stepped forward a few paces, bracing to run. "What are you afraid of?" Lonnie yelled. "I'm not afraid." "Bullshit, you're afraid of the boogeyman. You weren't even afraid of him when you pushed Tommy Doyle around at school today, though, were you?" "You pushed him, too. You know, and I don't see you going into this house." "Well, go on in. We'll follow you." "All right, then stand right there behind me." The two stragglers looked up. Faint silver shadows flashed over the structure as clouds scudded before the moon. The wind gusted, quickening the tattoo of the branches on the clapboard upstairs. All at once the bushes at the side of the house rattled, and a human figure burst out. "Get your asses away from there!" it bellowed, waving its hands. "Whoa! Yikes! Jesus!" Moving like the wind, the three tumbled off the porch and hurtled down the street, not stopping until they were safely locked behind the doors of their own homes. Sam Loomis grinned. It was a dirty trick, but he had to get them out of there, both for their sakes and for his own. Now he went back to his blind watching and waiting, shivering in the cold night air. He did not see the hand reach out for his shoulder, but at the first contact he whirled around in a fluid motion, the big gun materializing in his fist like a conjurer's hair. Hey, it's me, don't shoot!" "Good God, Brackett! Don't sneak up on me that way." "Sorry, Loomis. It's second nature to me. Put that bazooka away already." "Yes, of course. I'm rather jumpy, as you can see." "But you're all right?" "Sure. Has anything happened?" Brackett shook his head. "Nothing going on. Just the usual, kids playing pranks, trick-or-treating, parking and necking, getting high. I have a feeling you're way off on this one." "You have the wrong feeling," Loomis said firmly. "You're not coming up with much to prove me wrong, aside from one half-eaten dog." "Exactly. What more do you need?" "I don't know, but it's going to take a lot more than some sophisticated psychological interpretation to keep me up all night creeping around these here bushes." Loomis looked at him with the directness that made Brackett extremely uncomfortable. "I watched him for 15 years, sitting in a room, staring through the walls. If you can understand that, staring through the walls and seeing this night, he's waited for it, planned for it, focused his life on it. He's inhumanly patient, hour after hour, day after day, waiting for some silent, invisible alarm to trigger him, a voice to tell him the time has come, a gauge to tell him his blood has begun to boil. Death has arrived in your little town, Sheriff. You can ignore it, or you can help me stop it. Brackett shook his head skeptically. More fancy talk. You want to know what Haddonfield is? Families, children, nice homes, all lined up in white rows up and down these streets. Oak trees, picket fences, an old school with a new annex, a lot of churches, all denominations. A 5 and dime, a hardware store, a beauty parlor, a coffee shop, some bars and gas stations. I'm describing a small Midwestern town to you, Loomis, not a slaughterhouse. You could be describing both. I'll stay out with you tonight, Doctor, just on the chance that you're right. And if you are right, then damn you for letting him out. Loomis dropped his head. There was nothing he could say in reply. His name was Bob Sims, and the girls all thought he was gorgeous. He was tall and lanky, a pitcher for the baseball team, a tight end for the football team, possible valedictorian of the class, and at least one of its top 3 or 4 scholars. He could have any college he wanted and any girl. The girl he wanted on this particular night was Laurie and Annie's leggy friend Enda. Bob picked her up in his father's van, which had been customized as a recreational vehicle with a bunk bed in the back. Bob and Linda had made love back there many times, and though the car's heater worked, they preferred to make love in a house now that cold weather had set in. So when Annie had gotten her babysitting gig with Lindsay Wallace, the 2 girls had worked out a plan. As soon as Lindsay went to sleep, Annie's pa would come over, and they'd make out upstairs in the Wallace's bedroom, and Bob and Linda would do it downstairs on the convertible sofa. Good plan. You ready for a little trick-or-treat? Bob asked her when he picked her up, yanking the tab off the can of Budweiser with a loud pop and a rush of foam. Sure, Linda laughed. They laughed, embraced, and guzzled, then drove over to the Wallace house. As they pulled up in the front of the Wallace home, Linda reviewed the plan. Now, are you sure you've got it? Sure. First, I'll rip your clothes off. He leaned across to the passenger seat and buried his lips in Linda's soft neck while running a hand under her sweater. She laughed and spilled beer over his head. You idiot! Then you rip my clothes off. Then we rip Lindsay's clothes off. I think I've got it. You've got something, she said, sliding her hand up his muscular thigh. Now I've got something. Geez, Linda, Bob said with a rush of desire. Let's pray for a sleeping Lindsay. Yes, but in case our prayers aren't answered, maybe we can drop some Valium in her chocolate milk. You're terrible. Totally, Linda said, pushing open the door. Bob opened the door, got out, and helped Linda step down on the other side. They walked up the path to the big old house, and when they reached the front door, Bob scooped Linda effortlessly into his arms and carried her the rest of the way. Bob, put me down! Put me down! This is totally silly, Linda protested, though her feeble kicks belied her protest. She reached out and turned the knob of the front door. The door swung open, and the couple paused on the threshold. Annie? The house was dark and still. Annie, we're here! No answer. They let their eyes adjust to the darkness, then stepped into the home. They cocked their ears and thought they heard a creak upstairs. They called Annie's name again. Again, no answer. I wonder if they're here at all. I don't know, Bob said. Maybe they're upstairs already. Lindsay's asleep and Annie and Paul are up there already, Linda speculated. Bob turned on a light. I don't know. I don't want to be surprised in the middle of, Let's look for a note. Let's don't, Linda said, turning the light off and sliding into his arms. He pressed his mouth to hers, and her lips parted. Her tongue entwined with his as her body melted against his powerful torso. He slid his hands over her back and grabbed her buttocks, practically lifting her off the floor. "Now," she murmured, "shall we continue plan A?" "I guess," he said, leading her to the couch. "I just wish I could be sure about Annie and Paul." He went to the foot of the stairs and observed a light on under the door of the master bedroom. A faint creak came from there. He stood indecisively looking up. Linda came up behind him and put her arms around him. "Bob, the only thing you have to worry about is getting up for the occasion." "It's never been a problem before, and it shouldn't be now." He took her by the hand, and they lay on the couch. Linda's body arched up at once as if the seat of the couch was molten metal. She urged her breast and pelvis at her lover, and he took them avidly, pushing her sweater up to her neck and covering her breast and belly with kisses. Her nipples contracted into hard nuggets under the flicking of his warm tongue. And his hand caressed her belly lovingly, his fingers gliding beneath the tops of her jeans and under the silky smoothness of her bikini panties. His fingers undid the top snap of the jeans and artfully slid the zipper down, his hand coming to rest on the silky crotch of her pants. She moaned and strained her body upward to receive his caresses. In the shadow of the kitchen door he watched them. His breathing was heavy, but the noise of their excitement subdued the sound of his own. After the incredible moment of thrill as he plunged the blade into the dark-haired girl's abdomen and slid her stomach open to the ribs, he had come down to a state of euphoric calm. For a while he had thought that the lust was permanently discharged and the voice quieted. That was how it had been then, with Judy. But then he had been 6 years old. Now it was different. The sight of the couple on the couch had brought new stirring in his body, and the voice was whispering to him once more. He knew this night was not over. The phone rang and he shrank back into the cover of darkness. Bob and Linda sat up sharply, letting the phone ring 3 times in the hope that Annie would take it upstairs. The Wallaces would think it odd that someone other than their babysitter was picking up the phone. But when no one picked it up, Linda reached for the downstairs phone on the table beside the couch. "Hello?" Linda said dreamily. "Linda, is that you?" "Laurie, hi!" "Hi, what's happening?" "Wouldn't you like to know?" Linda giggled. "Hey, do you know where Annie is?" "Yeah, she's—" "Tommy, cut it out. Linda, just a sec." In the background, Linda heard a ghostly sound and screaming, then Laurie shouting, seeming to berate somebody. At length she got back on the phone. "Sorry, Tommy was chasing Lindsay around with a pumpkin on his head." "Lindsay's there?" Linda blurted. See, Annie decided to go over to Paul's, so she left Lindsay here with me." "Ah, so that means we have the house to ourselves." "Looks that way, but listen, would you please be sure to have Annie call me the second she gets back? I've got to get Lindsay back over there before her parents come home." "Fine." "Have a good time," Laurie said. "We're planning to." Linda hung up and grabbed Bob by the hand. "Well, oh boy, it looks like as if we've got the house all to ourselves, including the bed upstairs." Bob laughed. "Well now, to use your phrase, that sounds totally fantastic. Shall we go?" He offered his arm and she grabbed it. "Thank you, kind sir." He led the way up the stairs, hesitating before the door to the master bedroom, because the door was closed and a light streamed under it and into the hallway, a flickering orange light. Then he shrugged and opened the door. They laughed. On the night table, a jack-o'-lantern flickered. "Well, hello, Mr. Jack-o'-lantern. You're going to see some things tonight," Linda said, patting it on its pole. "How about this for starters?" Facing the pumpkin's grotesque grin, she did a sensuous striptease, wriggling out of her sweater and jiggling her breasts, cupping them with her hands in mute offering to the pumpkin, then bumping and grinding out of her jeans until she was prancing before the jack-o'-lantern in bikini panties. Bob laughed, reaching out and grabbing her wrist. "I'm jealous." "Of a pumpkin?" "Well, if you're into squashes so much, babe, why don't you try this zucchini?" he said, putting her hand on the rock-like bulge under his jeans. I have a sudden hunger for zucchini," she said, helping him unbuckle his belt and unbutton his jeans. His knees began to weaken, and he leaned on her shoulders for support. Then, when he could stand it no longer, he pulled her to her feet and toward the bed. Bob grinned and sat astride her, kneading her breast until the nipples were like stones. Her hips writhed under him, her pelvis thrusting involuntarily in circular motions. He needed no coaxing. Kneeling between her quivering thighs, he slid into her up to the hilt, and her moan of pleasure filled the room with its primitive timbre. He wrapped his arms tightly around her slim, firm waist, and she covered his broad back with sharp-nailed fingers. He pumped rhythmically into her, her hips stropping him to an awesome height of need and pleasure. "Oh, Bob, I think it's happening," she whimpered. "Me too." And that's when the phone rang again. Bob stopped in mid-stroke, gripped with uncertainty. "Shit, not again!" "Forget about it," Linda said. "We have more important things to do." The phone sounded again. "What if it's Annie?" "She'll call us again." "And what if it's the Wallaces?" "If it's the Wallaces and we answer, we'll get Annie into trouble." "Yeah, but what if—" "What if it's your mommy?" Linda taunted. Bob laughed. "I'll just tell her I'm really into something right now that I can't get out of." "There, it's stopped. I'll take it off the hook." He reached across her body to the night table, where the jack-o'-lantern guarded the telephone, and took the phone off its cradle. Then he turned his attention back to her. "Now, where were we?" "Old Mr. Zucchini's getting soft enough to mash," she said, stroking him with artful grinds of the pelvis. "There, that's better." "Oh yeah, that's better. That's much better." He stood in the hall watching them resume their coupling, and the desire returned. His fingers caressed the handle of his knife in rhythm to the powerful strokes of the man's buttocks against the widespread girl's body. The voice spoke loudly to him, urging him to act, but he held himself back, anxious to see the climax of their performance. He was soon rewarded. "Oh, Bob, I think it's going to happen now. Now. "Yeah?" Bob cried, nailing her to the bed with his lanky, powerful body. Their voices mingled moans and pants and endearments as they thrashed at the last lust out of one another's flesh. Then they lay still for a minute or two, the boy's back a tempting target for the blade of the man who stood outside their door, breathing deeply but silently. No, not yet. At length Bob rolled off Linda and groped around the floor for his shirt. He found it and produced a pack of cigarettes and lit two, giving her one of them. They lay on their backs, blowing thin streams of smoke into the air. "Fantastic," Linda sighed. "Totally fantastic." "Yeah." "Want a beer?" "Yeah." "Is that all you have to say?" "Yeah." "Go get me a beer." "I thought you were going to get one for me," Bob said. "Yeah?" "Oh, well." Reluctantly, Bob climbed out of bed and stepped into his jeans. Then he groped around the floor for his glasses and found them at last, donning them. Linda looked at him. "Do you really need those?" "Only wear them when I'm looking for beer," he replied with a grin. "I'll be right back." He leaned over the bed and kissed her. "Don't get dressed." Silently, the visitor withdrew from his observation place outside the door and drifted soundlessly down the stairs, taking his place in the large utility closet in the kitchen. He waited and listened, knife poised. In due time, through the slightly open door, he saw the boy come into the kitchen. He had on jeans but no shirt or shoes and socks, and he wore horn-rimmed glasses. The boy's body was sleek, hairless, and muscular. Bob went directly to the refrigerator in the dark and opened the door, sending a stream of light across the kitchen floor. He took 2 beers out, closed the door, and opened a cupboard. "Peanuts, peanuts, peanuts. Ah, here they are. And potato chips. Where you at, potato chips? There they are." He gathered the food in his arms and turned to leave, but didn't see the legs of a stool half under a counter, and he tripped, dropping everything. Muttering, he stooped and picked it up. Then he heard the creak of a door behind him. Arms loaded, he freed a hand and opened the kitchen door. "Annie? Paul?" he called. "No jokes, huh? I'm in the midst of something very important." No answer. He closed the door and locked it. Then he heard the creak again and realized it was coming from the utility closet. He put the beer and food down on the counter and stealthily approached the door. Then he flung it open. "Okay, Linda, come on out. Come on, I know it's..." The thing lunged out like a leaping tiger, its left hand gripping Bob's neck in a death clutch. Bob fell back, grabbing at his throat, then swung at the head of his tormentor. The man took the blow full on the face, but it did not faze him. He slammed Bob up against the wooden pantry door and lifted him clear off the tile floor by the throat. Gurgling noises came from his windpipe as he clawed at the rubber mask on his assailant's face. If Bob was going to escape, he'd have to make his best shot now, because the oxygen supply was rapidly dwindling, and he knew he had but a few moments. He cupped his hands over his head and brought them down with full force on the man's head. It shook him, but failed to weaken his grip on Bob's throat. Out of the corner of his eye, Bob saw the blade in the man's free hand, and he brought his knees up in a helpless gesture of self-protection. He actually heard the whap of the knife as the killer drove it into his gut with stupendous force. Then the blackness came over him. Linda dragged impatiently on her cigarette, then ground it out in the ashtray on the night table, just under the grimacing mouth of the jack-o'-lantern. "Well, Jack, where is he? I sent him down 10 minutes ago for one lousy beer. Is he manufacturing it or what? If he were half the man he looks like, he'd have made the round trip in record time and would be back in bed by now. Isn't that right, Mr. Jack?" The pumpkin's flame answered her with mute flickering. Linda tapped another cigarette out of the pack and hung it on her lower lip. Then she grinned with inspiration. "Hey, baby, light my fire," she said to the jack-o'-lantern, thrusting the cigarette through the pumpkin's nose and lighting it on its candle. "Thanks. You may look like a punk, but deep down inside, you're a real gentleman. Not like some people." She heard the steps creaking and composed herself under the covers. The steps were heavy, like an old man's or someone laboring under a big load. "Thank God," Linda sighed. "There's my beer." The door opened and she laughed, shaking her head. He wore a sheet over his head with eyes cut out, and over the eyes he wore Bob's glasses. He stood inside the door staring at her, breathing in long sighing wheezes that blew the sheet away from his mouth with each exhale. "Cute, Bob, real cute. Come here, you fool." He came no closer. "I'll bet I can get your ghost," she said, sliding the sheet teasingly off her chest. Linda laughed at her own joke, but when the ghost remained planted in the doorway, she frowned and brusquely pulled the sheets back up around her throat. All right, so where's the beer?" No response. "Well, answer me." "Okay, don't answer me. Boys are so weird." Still no response. The ghost stood fixed to his spot like a tree. "Bob, enough's enough. You're making me nervous." No response. "Oh, shit. Okay, for you." She got out of bed. Completely nude, she walked to the pile of clothes at the foot of the bed. In the soft glow of the candle, she looked incredibly beautiful. She did not walk so much as glide. She knew what effect she had on men, and if this didn't do the trick, Bob must be made of brick. She pulled her panties out of the pile and dangled them in front of the ghost glasses, stroking them with her other hand. "Last chance, pal, before I hide the jewels." She paused, waiting for a reply. Then she shrugged. "Okay." She stepped into her panties and turned away. "Well, I'm going to call Laurie. I want to know where Annie and Paul are anyways. This isn't going anywhere, apparently." She picked up the phone and pivoted, turning her back on the ghost. She dialed the Doyle's number. The ghost began to advance. Linda could see him coming out of the corner of her eye. While she waited for Laurie to pick up the phone, she said, "Well, I finally got you to make your move. I knew it. As soon as I hide my ass, you want to pull my pants down. You men are all... Ow!" He clamped one hand over her mouth, and with the other wrapped the phone cord around her throat. She reacted with the ferocity of a victim in full panic, clawing at his knuckles with sharp nails and tearing strips of flesh off the back of his hand. He gripped her more tightly despite the searing pain. On the other end of the phone line, he could hear someone saying, "Hello? Hello?" He gripped the wire tighter. The girl danced madly in his clutches, biting and kicking, wriggling, scratching, pounding, pulling, striking. She fought harder than any of them, fought with amazing pluck, but it was all for naught, all for naught. Her movements began to slow down and become more jerky and frenetic. Her face was turning blue, and her tongue flopped around her lips as if it had no organic connection with the rest of her body. Her eyes bulged like a frog's, the red blood vessels in the whites bursting with the overload. With one last frantic effort, she aimed 10 fingernails at his eyes, but he buried his face in the back of her neck so that she had no good target. Her nails tangled in the bedsheet. When her hands went limp at last, they dragged the sheet with them, revealing her assassin. He wore a grotesque mask. "Hello? Hello?" Laurie tapped her fingernails impatiently on the phone. "All right, Annie, I've heard your famous chewing. Now I get your famous squills?" The gurgles and sputters continued. "Annie! Annie, are you all right?" Now she heard a heavy, throaty breathing. "Annie, are you fooling around again? Annie, I'll kill you if this is a joke. Oh, God, I cannot wait for this day to end," she said, slamming the phone down. She went to the window and looked across the street. Bob's van was still parked there, but except for an orange glow from an upstairs window, all the lights in the Wallace house were out. Laurie decided to phone there one more time. If nobody answered, she'd have to run across the street. She dialed the Wallace number and waited. The phone rang 4, 5, 6, 7 times. With each ring, Laurie prayed harder that the joke would be over, that Linda or Bob or Annie or Paul would pick it up and, with a big laugh, tell her it was all a big put-on. 8 rings, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15... 16 rings. Chapter 14. Laurie put the phone down heavily and stood beside it, pondering her options. It was not so much that she didn't know what she must do. It was that she didn't want to do what she knew she must. She tiptoed upstairs. Tommy and Lindsay were sprawled on Tommy's bed like a couple of rag dolls dropped from 10 feet, hands and feet dangling over the sides, and an assortment of dolls, game pieces, cars, trucks, fire engines, and erector set components covered the bed and floor as if all had been packed into the muzzle of a mortar and fired indiscriminately into the room. Tommy was in his pajamas, but Lindsay, who had not been expected to stay so late, was still in her clothes. Laurie felt safe in leaving them. She knew from countless babysitting assignments with them that their deepest slumber was immediately after falling asleep. They would not wake up and, not finding her in the house, push the panic button. She went back downstairs and opened her purse. She had a ring with 4 or 5 keys belonging to the people she regularly sat for, and she selected the one to the Wallace home. She opened the front door of the Doyle house, stepped outside, and looking ruefully across the street, closed it behind her. She crossed the street and stood before the Wallace house, studying its hulking vastness for a sign of life. Except for the mellow flicker of a candle upstairs, there was none. She glanced in Bob's van, but nobody was in it as well. Her feet felt as if they'd been fitted with leaden shoes as she walked the last few yards and mounted the steps to the veranda encircling the house. She tested the knob of the front door. There was no need for her key. The door swung wide open. She peered inside, listening. She thought she heard a floorboard groan, but maybe not. She stepped inside and stood in the arched entrance to the living room. "Annie? Bob? Linda?" The total silence that greeted her sent a shudder down her spine. She reached for the wall switch and flipped it. The room remained dark. Cursing, she retreated to the entry hall and tried the switch to the big chandelier there. No response. "You guys really have been blowing some fuses," she said with a nervous laugh. She stayed in the hall a moment longer, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness. Then she ventured into the living room. It was devoid of life, but an examination of the rumpled pillows on the couch indicated that some heavy petting had gone on. They were probably upstairs. All of them? She wondered. "Oh, Lord, just what I need, walking in on my best friends having an orgy," she said aloud. She jumped when she heard something heavy like furniture being moved upstairs, followed by a crash. She rushed to the foot of the stairs and stared up. The bedroom door was closed, but an eerie orange light radiated from under it. She managed to smile, shaking her head. "All right, meatheads, the joke is over." She took one tentative step up the stairs and paused to listen. "Come on, Annie, enough." A new sound greeted her, the sound of something being dragged across the floor. The sound stopped abruptly, followed by a closet door shutting in the upstairs bedroom. Laurie took 3 more steps. "This has definitely stopped being funny, guys. Now cut it out!" Now a scraping sound. Her heart began to thunder, and she thought of fleeing, but she knew what kind of laughingstock she'd be at school if she did. When Annie and Paul and Linda and Bob told everybody how they'd scared Laurie Strode out of her shoes on Halloween. "You'll be sorry!" she shouted as she made her way up the stairs with determination. Sam Loomis was cold and getting colder. Had he known he'd be staked out in a hedge in the middle of a cold October night, he'd have dressed for the occasion. But he had worn his trench coat over a summer business suit, and he was cold. Aside from the 3 kids he'd chased off, there'd been no activity at the Myers house, and as the evening wore into night, Loomis began to wonder why he had expected that there would be. Yes, the fellow had returned to the scene of the crime in the best tradition of criminals, but that was much earlier. To what end would he hang around the house? Wouldn't he seek elsewhere for victims? Because he was cold and because he'd begun to realize he was barking up the wrong tree, Loomis started to pace. He paced up the block and down, glancing over his shoulder, often so as not to take his attention totally off the Myers home. He paced in an ever-lengthening pattern, and the more he did, the more certain he became that his quarry was near. His conclusion was based on reason and emotion. Intellectually, he reasoned that with the strange affection of a hunter for his prey, his maniac had indeed come home today, and he'd seek victims in the immediate neighborhood. But it wasn't just intellectual deduction, it was a feeling, a hunch. Loomis's spine quivered like a divining rod near water. Evil was afoot, and it was nearby. If only he could get some definite sign. Loomis's pacing swept him farther and farther away from the Myers house, and soon he was turning his back on it with impunity, for he was now convinced his maniac was not there. Back and forth like a pendulum Loomis swung, attuning himself to the vibrations of evil in the air and trying to get a fix on them like a pilot seeking radio guidance on a stormy night. He debated with himself as to whether he should continue going straight up and down the block or turn corners and form kind of a search grid with his pacing. At a certain corner he felt strongly drawn and decided to let the force carry him even if he lost sight of the Myers house entirely. It was as if he were the planchette on a Ouija board and someone had asked him, "Is a murderer near at hand?" The force of the vibrations was sending him. Where? Down this oak-lined street and toward that car? Why that car? But it was not a car, it was a station wagon. A station wagon! Could it be the one? His pace quickened. It was hard to tell the color of the vehicle because of the yellow arc light of the street lamps overhead, but it seemed to be that livid purplish brown of the state hospital station wagon. One glance at the side of the vehicle would tell him. He strained his eyes, seeking the emblem on the door, his legs churning at a pace they hadn't done for a decade. And inside his head the vibrations of evil grew immeasurably stronger with each yard he covered. She stood on the landing, paralyzed with uncertainty. At the foot of the stairs she'd been certain this was a big put-on by her friends, but with each step she mounted, her doubts had mounted as well. If this were a practical joke, it was, well, too good. Too professional. Where were the whispering and the giggling, the shushing and the tittering? There was too much silence, entirely too much silence. She peered at the crack under the door, a mellow orange light that shimmered through it, seductively like a neon sign advertising some forbidden delight. She clenched her teeth. If this was a setup, they were doing a terrific job. Special effects and everything. How could she not go in? She stepped forward 2 paces and encircled the doorknob with her hand. The muscles of her legs were tense like those of a runner at the start of a race, prepared to spring back and down the stairs at the first sign of trouble. She pushed the door open a crack. She could see a pair of feet on the bed, but whose she couldn't yet identify. Just out of the range of her vision, a candle or jack-o'-lantern cast an orange light on the legs. Laurie opened the door 2 inches farther and stuck her head into the bedroom. She took in more and more of the figure on the bed, the feet, the knees, the thighs, the pubic hair, the pelvis, the belly slit from waist to throat. The intestines spilled out on the bed linens, the gash across the throat, splashed blood, the white, bloodless face of Annie, a silent scream on her mouth, the lucid horror of doom in her wide eyes, and behind her head, a tombstone. The tombstone said, "Our beloved daughter, Judith Margaret Myers." There were dates, but Laurie did not read them, because things happened too fast from that moment on. She heard her own scream and realized in an instant that whatever it was that had slaughtered her best friend must be here, near, waiting for her. It was then that she caught sight of Bob suspended by the throat from a rope tied around a ceiling fixture. His tongue, purple and bloated, dangled idiotically from swollen lips, and bloody gore spilled from a fist-size hole in his abdomen. Laurie's legs seemed to melt beneath her, and her will to flee flowed out of them as if released by a spigot. The time it took her to turn seemed like a week, but as she did pivot, a closet on her right opened, revealing Linda, propped up in a chair, nude. From the neck down, unlike Annie and Bob, her body was unmarred, but her neck and face were livid with broken blood vessels, as if some stupendous force had squeezed all her blood up into her head until the pressure had burst every capillary in her skin. Her red eyes all but bulged out of her head on their stalks, and her tongue slavered over her lower lip like a mongoloid's. If Laurie was screaming now, the pounding fear in her brain made it impossible for her to hear it. For someone whose experience of horror had been limited up to that moment to the sight of small animals run over on the highway, the load on her circuits was tantamount to sending 1,000,000 volts through a wire designed to carry 100. What prevented her from passing out at that instant she did not know, but a voice inside her brain demanded that she take measures to survive, and she concentrated on it despite every instinct to submit to blind panic. At the same moment that she came to this conclusion, she saw a shadow, dark and dreadful, looming up in the flicker of the jack-o'-lantern. She knew it was the man who'd been dogging her steps that day, and she knew that he expected her to drop backward so that he could catch her off balance. So she did something illogical, and it saved her life. She ducked. She dropped to her haunches as he lunged for her. His hand swiped at her neck as he tripped over her shoulder, grabbing and tearing the arm of her blouse, but he got no more of her than that. But now she had a bigger problem, for he'd sprawled on the landing, blocking her way down the stairs. He grunted and rose to his feet slowly, almost casually. He had her cornered, and it was just a matter of closing the gap. He reached into his belt and drew out a huge knife clotted with blood. Laurie backed away, wondering if she could lure her attacker away from the stairs. But as he advanced on her, he kept his body between her and the landing. Like a computer, her brain assessed the possibilities. She could retreat into the bedroom and try to bar the door. Too chancy. She could flee into another room. That was no safer. Or she could dive over the stairway railing and take her chances with the drop. That's what it had to be. She glanced over the rail and estimated it to be 8 or 10 feet to the first floor. She braced for the leap just as he was bracing for his. She sprang, placing her hand on the rail as if it were a gymnastic horse, and boosted her legs over it. For a second she clutched the railing. His grip was tremendously strong, but he was in an awkward position. Trying desperately to hold her with his left hand, he swiped at her with the knife in his right, but it grazed her arm and he released her. She tried to make her feet land squarely on the steps below, but her right foot caught one step poorly, and a sharp pain shot up her ankle. Her right arm burned where the tip of his knife had caught her. As she clutched it, she felt the wetness of blood. But she was alive, and now she had to get out of here. She could see him doubled over the railing, but he recovered quickly and made for the landing. Laurie climbed to her feet. The pain in her ankle was excruciating, but she managed to hobble toward the kitchen. She heard him stumping down the stairs. As she reached the security of the kitchen, she could see him turning the bend of the stairway, the still of his knife blade glinting with the reflected light from the street lamps. She flung the kitchen door shut and grabbed a steel chair from the dinette table. She propped it under the doorknob a scant second before she felt the thud of his shoulder against the door and heard his muffled grunt of frustration. She limped to the outside door and turned the knob. It was locked or jammed, probably intentionally, probably by the same hand that had knocked out the lights. She groped for the button that she knew unlocked some types of storm door, but she couldn't find it. All of a sudden, the other door exploded as his fist penetrated it, sending wooden shrapnel across the room. The door boards groaned and splayed inward as his arm sank through them to the shoulder. Laurie watched with round-eyed fascination before returning to her task of getting out. She shook the knob in desperation, but did little more than rattle the glass. Behind her, she could hear him widening the hole in the door with the second splintering punch. Well, she told herself, struggling to keep her wits, if he can smash his door, I can smash mine. She looked around for a blunt instrument or even a towel to cushion her hand from the glass shards, but finding none and hearing the chair propping up the other door sliding to the floor, she balled her fist and struck the pane nearest the knob. It shattered and she felt a dozen glass claws rupturing the flesh of her knuckles. But if there was pain, it was overridden by driving fear and desperation. She groped for a lock and found a little butterfly bolt under the knob. She twisted it and turned the inside knob with her other hand, shoving the frame with her shoulder. The door gave and she fell outside just as she heard him kicking the chair out of his way and lumbering across the kitchen floor. Still guided by a semblance of reason, she shut the door behind her and twisted the lock to give herself another few seconds of time. As she picked herself up and limped toward the house next door, she heard his grunted frustration upon finding the second door locked. He tried to rattle the door off its frame, and she could hear every pane of glass vibrating. She leaned against the doorbell of the Martinson home, which she knew to be occupied by an aged and not particularly friendly couple. It seemed to make an eternity for them to respond, but a light did go on. She pounded on the door, shrieking, "Please, help me! Call the police! Please!" She saw a hand part a shade and an eye peer out at her. "Please, call the police!" she shouted at the face. The window lifted an inch. "No more trick-or-treat, it's late. Go away! We have no more candy!" "Oh, God!" Laurie groaned as the light went out. At that moment she heard a pane of glass smash and her pursuer's hand thumping on the outside of the side door looking for the lock. Dragging her bad ankle, she made her way across the street. She looked over her shoulder and saw the side door burst open and the black shape stagger out into the driveway. He looked around, then spotted her. She was almost at the Doyles' front door. The key! Where was the key? She had clutched a ring of keys in her hand when she entered the Wallace home. Her jeans had been too tight to stuff a key ring into her pockets, so she had carried them into the home. And somewhere in the melee she had dropped them. He was coming after her in steady, unhurried steps, knife bared as if daring the world to stop him. Anyone looking out at the scene would see a Halloween mime presented by a couple of clever youngsters. Why those shrieks of hers were so blood-curdling, they might be the real thing. And look how cunningly he'd painted that knife blade to look like blood. Laurie pounded the door with the flat palm of her hand. "Tommy! Tommy, open the door! I'm locked out!" She thumped with her closed fist. "Tommy, wake up! It's me! Laurie, wake up!" She looked around her and found a geranium planter beside the doormat. She picked it up, stepped back, and threw it at the bedroom window, where Tommy and Lindsay were sleeping. "Please, God, smash!" "Tommy, wake up! It's me, Laurie! Hurry!" She stood helplessly waiting for that welcome face to appear in the window. She continued shouting. The shape was halfway across the street now, the features of his face resolving under the streetlight. Either it was a rubber mask or a real face too hideous to imagine. "Tommy!" A sleepy face peered out of the broken glass. "Laurie?" "Tommy, hurry down and open the door! Hurry!" The face disappeared, and Laurie prayed the kid didn't think he was dreaming and go back to bed. The murderer was on the lawn now and loping toward her, knife poised. Laurie's mind flashed on the sight of Annie with her belly ripped open and her guts hanging out on the bed. "Tommy, hurry!" The blessed sound of a bolt being thrown open. She twisted the doorknob and shoved her way inside, knocking Tommy down. She slammed the door and twisted the lock and drove home a second bolt as Tommy picked himself up and rubbed his eyes. "Tommy, I want you to go back upstairs." "What is it, Laurie?" "Be quiet. Get Lindsay and get back into the bedroom and lock the door." "I'm scared." "Do what I say, now." He backed away toward the stairs. "Laurie?" "What?" "It's the boogeyman, isn't it?" "Hurry!" Tommy burst into hysterical sobs as he scampered up the stairs. The bedroom door slammed and clicked as Tommy locked it. She could hear Tommy and Lindsay making each other crazy with fear, but there was no time to spare to calm them down. She dashed for the phone and picked it up, waiting for a dial tone. Finger poised over the dial. No dial tone yet. The phone was dead. She slammed it down and stood paralyzed, trying to determine her next move. A breeze rippled through the air, rustling through her hair. It was coming from the kitchen. She took one step toward the kitchen, then stopped and backed away. If the door was already open, it was too late. He was already in the home. Now it overwhelmed her. The reality of evil, the horror of reality, penetrated to a brain that since birth had been programmed to perceive horror and evil as something that could be contained within the perimeter of a 19-inch television tube. The shock was so violent, she thought she could go mad. She buried her face and let out a mournful wail, followed by choking sobs. "Please, please stop," she whimpered, sinking to her knees before the living room couch. "Please!" She became aware of another sound in the room. Someone was breathing heavily and advancing on her. "Please!" Sam Loomis ran up the street, head tilted like a bloodhound trying to pick up a scent. Except this wasn't a smell he was seeking, but a feeling, a vibration. "You're getting hot. No, you're getting cold. No, you're getting hot again. Hotter. No, colder," a voice seemed to say to him. His eyes searched house after house, hoping to detect something out of kilter, but he was greeted with the disappointing sight of prim house after prim house, nestled beneath sheltering trees on pleasantly manicured lawns. If only this were 19th century Transylvania, he said blackly to himself. "I'd know where to search, but this is the last quarter of the 20th century in a lovely suburban town in the Midwest in modern America. Surely any manifestation of evil would shine like a beacon." "God damn your soul! Show yourself!" he cried at the night sky. A pair of headlights pinned him as a police car swerved onto the street. The car pulled to an abrupt halt next to him. "Where the hell were you?" Brackett shouted from his window. Loomis could see his face flushed with rage. "I went back to the Myers house and—" Loomis impatiently waved him quiet. "I found the hospital station wagon. He's here!" "Where's the car?" "3 blocks down. Look, you go up this street and back down the next one. I'll go this way and crisscross you. Honk your horn if you see anything. Fire your gun if it's serious. I'll fire mine." "And if I see him?" "Fire your gun at his heart." Okay, Slashaholics, that was chapters 13 and 14 of Halloween, the novelization by Curtis Richards. Only one chapter remains after tonight, folks, so the next upload of this book will be the conclusion. And man, that last half of tonight's upload was just so intense. Even for me narrating it, I could just feel it. Curtis Richards is a fantastic writer when it comes to these intense stalking scenes and chasing scenes and death scenes. The sex scene's a little awkward, but the rest of it, wow. Tonight's upload I thought was great. I really enjoyed both chapters. Enjoyed his take on the deaths. Enjoyed his take on the little fight between Laurie and Michael when she was trying to escape to get back over to the Doyle's house. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to the conclusion. But guys, let me know what you thought of tonight's upload, and I'll be back very soon with the final chapter. As always, tonight's upload was brought to you by our patrons over on the Patreon page. That's Catherine McClear, Carl Eakins, Cecilia Spears, Sean Campbell, and Hawaii. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel, and if anybody else enjoys the content here and wants to help this channel keep going and growing until we get every out-of-print slasher novel ever written into audiobook form for everyone to enjoy, then click the link in the description below. You can get a tier on the Patreon page to support the channel for as low as $2 or $5 a month at the lowest tier. And you'll be doing a great service to the channel, and you get some really cool stuff for doing so. But yeah, guys, really great upload tonight. I'm really pumped for the final chapter. Want to hear from you guys what you thought, what your expectations are going in. Is the ending going to be different than the movie? Did Curtis Richards have a different take on how it all ended? We're going to find out in the very next upload of this book, guys. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, keep it scary, and I'll see you next time.